off with the first question then. In your book, Human Compatible, you list 3 principles to guide the development of beneficial machines, being, firstly, the machine's only objective is to maximize the realization of human preferences. Secondly, the machine is initially uncertain about what those preferences are. And finally, the ultimate source of information about human preferences is human behavior. So my question is, first of all, how do we measure human preferences without asking the human for the cost function? And I'll just kind of add to that you've mentioned that inverse reinforcement learning is a possible approach, but many humans display very bad behavior. So how could we possibly try to combat this? And should we even try to?
Okay, so you're asking a lot of questions at once.
Yeah. Sorry, a bit loaded there.
So the third principle, right, that the evidence for human preferences is human behavior. I mean, it's not strictly true because we could probably develop some kind of fMRI technology that directly examines the human brain to figure out what people want, which might be useful for patients who are completely paralyzed, for example. But generally speaking, the idea is that we have preferences about the future, some of which we are aware of, some of which we've never even thought about. But if someone presented us a particular future, we'd be able to say, yeah, no, we don't like that one, right? And those preferences are expressed through behavior. And the behavior could include things like saying, I'd like a cup of tea, or stop doing that, or whatever you did then, that was great, or so it could be verbal behavior or physical behavior. Everything that the human race has ever done is evidence for what human preferences are. And so there is a massive amount of information. And, so inverse reinforcement learning is a particular special case of how to infer preferences from behavior. And it sort of assumes that there's basically one human acting in isolation, solving whatever problem it is they want to solve and optimizing whatever reward function it is they're trying to optimize. And then we try to figure out how to invert the behavior to get at the underlying reward function. And that's a pretty well-developed technology. I mean, there are literally thousands of papers exploring how to do this in various settings. More recently, we've generalized this to account for the fact that when a human is behaving, there is actually at least one other entity in the environment of the human, namely the robot who's doing the learning. And so that gives the human an incentive to behave differently from the way they would behave if they were by themselves. Right? So for example, they would say to the robot, here, look at the bad thing that happens when I do this, right? Or whatever you do, don't do this, or so all kinds of things that the human would never do if the robot wasn't there. So, teaching, warning, explaining, and the human has an incentive to get the robot to learn about human preferences as fast as possible, so that the robot could actually be helpful. And so the second question you asked was about bad behavior. And so one of the characteristics of the kind of learning we're talking about is that it doesn't result in copying behavior. And that would be sort of silly, right? So if I drink a cup of coffee, I don't want the robot to drink a cup of coffee. Right? We're not doing imitation learning. Right? We want the robot to learn that I might, if I'm drinking it, I must like it, and then maybe drink me a cup of coffee without being asked, but not to drink my coffee. And so by the same principle, if someone acts in a way that's harmful to others, the the robot doesn't copy that.
Sure.
What the robot is doing is trying to understand, well, why is the person doing that? What preferences lead to behave that way?
Yeah.
And having learned about those preferences, so I think in many cases, not all, but in many cases, the reason people behave badly towards others, for example, the reason they steal, is because they have their own needs, and maybe they don't have the means of satisfying their own needs in an unselfish way. And perhaps they have less concern for the well-being of others than they should. So if the example I give in Human Incompatible is the passport official who insists on taking bribes because government salary is paltry and he wants to send his children to college, and that's very expensive. And so what does the robot do? Does the robot start taking bribes from people? No, the robot says, okay, how can we help this guy send his kids to college without impinging negatively on the preferences of others? So in fact, the robot, because it has no preferences of its own, unlike so even the most altruistic human still has preferences intrinsic to themselves, right? They want food, they want shelter, they want physical security. The robot wants none of those things. And so it's going to act more altruistically than the most altruistic human.
Sure. So, but I guess then that still kind of assumes some higher moral code. Like then, for example, not stealing, knowing that stealing is bad is still something that's to some extent human decided in some way.
No, I think, well, it depends on which moral theory one subscribes to. But in the book, I push to the extent possible on the utilitarian approach, which says that stealing is bad, not because stealing is bad, but because it impinges negatively on the preferences of others. And so if you're a utilitarian, you don't approve of stealing. And Mill, who wrote, I guess after Bentham, wrote the book on utilitarianism, goes to great lengths to say, yes, of course, we have moral codes, but in the same way that we have a nautical almanac so that sailors don't have to redo all of the astronomical calculations from scratch every time they set out to sea. Moral code is a compilation into rules of first principles utilitarian calculations about what's good, what's the best for everyone. How can we organize our lives so that the outcome is as good as possible for our whole society? So
do you then therefore think that kind of this is a better approach to follow than, for example, maximizing all human happiness? I mean, let's say that we could look inside everyone's brain and essentially compute the calculation. What's the thing that makes everyone on average the happiest, or something like this?
Well, they
seem like slightly different things, maybe. What makes everyone happiest versus what might be kind of inherent to this kind of moral code? They might not necessarily be the same outcome.
Well, I think, you're getting at a point of debate in philosophy right now. As far as I've read, right, they actually do polls of philosophers and say, do you subscribe to utilitarianism, deontological, i.e. sort of moral rules and rights, or virtue ethics? And it's about 1/3 each. So no one is in the majority. As I said in the Reef lectures, the deontological and the virtue ethics people have combined in an unholy alliance to keep the utilitarians out of power. And I think utilitarianism is a little bit unfashionable for, I think, very superficial reasons, right? So one thing, just the word itself has negative connotations because it also means sort of, gray, concrete, blocky, utilitarian architecture, utilitarian furniture, and so on, which is just a confusion. And also, I think there are a lot of straw man arguments about utilitarians, saying, oh, well, utilitarians would happily kill someone and harvest their organs if they could save 2 lives by doing that. Right? And that's complete nonsense. Ultimately, utilitarians are consequentialists, which means that what they care about is, when you act, do the results make things better for everyone or worse for everyone? And the argument, the difficulty that the moral theorist, someone who bases things on moral rights and rules, the deontologist has to address is the following, right? In cases where the utilitarian and the deontological approaches disagree, it's because the deontological approach results in worse outcomes for everybody.
Yeah.
So how does the deontologist justify choosing actions that result in worse outcomes for everybody in the long run, not just in the immediate future, but in the long run, worse for everyone if we do this? What's your justification? And so I'm not religiously sticking to utilitarianism. It's a natural, from the point of view of AI, it's all about maximizing objectives. It's a natural thing to try to do. And but then, until proven otherwise, it seems like let's run with this and see what we can do with it.